So I want to talk this morning about the allure of conditional happiness. We've been talking along this theme recently, and happiness is sort of a universal pursuit, but in our culture and in other cultures as well, we tether it often to external conditions, wealth, relationships, career, success, material possessions. We've talked about that the last couple of weeks, and as you know, from a Buddhist perspective, this form of happiness is considered fleeting and illusory. And the Buddha offered an alternative to conditional happiness, in which he defined worldly pleasures as transient in nature. He offers a deeper, more enduring form of contentment that's rooted internally. We've talked about that the last 2 weeks. And conditional happiness is understood in contemporary society is almost always viewed as contingent upon external circumstances which align with our desires and expectations. And if we have desires and expectations and align on the external circumstances, at least temporarily, we may experience some happiness, although it's fleeting and temporary. The joy is temporary. And when that doesn't happen, when our wishes and so forth and desires don't align with external circumstances, which is not infrequent, we suffer. And this form of happiness, this conditional happiness, is inherently unstable because it depends on factors beyond our control. We can't really always control the outcome of our wishes. I use the example often of acquiring that new iPhone, which brings temporary delight, but the joy is short-lived because the novelty wears off, and pretty soon I have a new desire. Within a week or two, it's just a phone. In Buddhism, this is akin to I think I mentioned this term on Saturday, akin to the concept of samsara, characterized by suffering and dissatisfaction. Conditional happiness is part of this cycle of samsara, perpetuating attachment and craving, which are fundamental sources of suffering according to the Four Noble Truths. And we talk here often about that all phenomena are impermanent, including the conditions we rely on for happiness, and especially the conditions we rely on for happiness. The Buddha likened the pursuit of conditional happiness to drinking salt water to quench one's thirst in one of the suttas. He says, it exacerbates the problem. It provides temporary relief. You're drinking salt water, you think, oh, well, it's quenching my thirst, but of course, it doesn't work. It actually makes the problem worse. And this analogy underscores the futility of seeking lasting happiness in impermanent things. The law of impermanence highlights that everything we experience is subject to change. Relationships end, possessions are lost, the novelty wears off, achievements are forgotten. It goes on and on. No source of conditional happiness ever lasts. Full stop. Grasping these transient sources of happiness only leads to inevitable disappointment, loss, and suffering. And we see then how, when we really look at it with clarity, how conditional happiness is simply an illusion. It's like a drug. It's like an addiction. It's like pressing that bar repeatedly. It's a fleeting mirage that distracts us from true, lasting contentment. And I prefer the word contentment to happiness. I mean, to me, happiness connotes this sort of fleeting experience. Contentment is more, it's a little quieter, it's a little more reflective, but it's also more enduring when we can tap into it. And Buddhism offers a different perspective on happiness. It points us in the direction of contentment. And this arises from a deep understanding of the nature of reality and the cultivation of inner peace and tranquility. And the beauty of it is this form of happiness is not dependent on external conditions. It's rooted in seeing things clearly and in the cultivation of equanimity. The Eightfold Path, as we know, is central tenet, primary teaching of Buddhism, provides a practical guide for achieving contentment. I spent so much of my life pursuing conditional happiness. That's just what I thought was the way to go. it was a fruitless endeavor. And we know that marketers and advertisers constantly push stuff at us, telling us it's going to make us happy. If we drive this car, if we drink this beer, if we use this shampoo, I mean, whatever. This path, the Buddhist path, offers a roadmap to help transcend the cycle of craving, transcend the cycle of grasping, and managing aversion, that all of which those things fuel conditional happiness. Pushing away aversion, clinging and grasping, all fuel conditional happiness. We begin this journey, as you know, with meditation to help train the mind to remain steady and calm, regardless of external circumstances. I mean, think about it. So much of our grasping and clinging and trying to acquire external things or change external things is a form of reactivity. I see an ad, oh, I must have that. It's reactive. I'm not responding with equanimity. I'm not responding with clarity. I'm believing that in that moment, this thing or this whatever will bring me happiness. And so we begin with meditation to calm the mind and see that reactivity is only going to ultimately bring disappointment. We're not going to be so easily seduced by that new shiny object. Additionally, our practice helps us manage the ego, which is often the source of the craving that produces conditional happiness that external factors offer. Okay? My ego wants the shiny new thing. It wants to look good, appear good, feel good, on and on and on. But it's fleeting again, and it will always end in suffering and disappointment. Buddhism instead offers an alternative path, one that's characterized by compassion and loving kindness and equanimity and all the things we talk about. Because these qualities help lessen the ego's demands. It helps foster a sense of interconnection and bring spaciousness to so much of our worldview. When we're in a craving, grasping mindset, we have tunnel vision. You know, we only see that thing which we're craving. You know, we're pushing the bar like the rat in the cage. But when we shift from that and from this focus on our self-centered desires to a more broad compassion for self and others, this leads to a more profound and enduring form of happiness. And I can tell you in my own life that this has been the case. You know, an example of this is the joy that we feel when we practice generosity. You know, our practice encourages us, the Buddha taught, to develop an open heart and a generous spirit, to shift from seeking happiness just for ourselves to wish for happiness for all beings. You know, that whole notion of sympathetic joy. I'm so happy for your good fortune. I'm so happy for your health. I'm so happy, you know, that you have, you know, good things going on in your life. You know, that takes us out of ourselves. It takes us out of a clinging, reactive mindset. And it's through a less selfish and a more selfless orientation that true happiness can be realized. Generosity being the prime example. And the other thing that does is that it sort of aligns with the Buddhist teaching on non-self. You know, it's not me, mine all the time. We're always swimming against the tide because the cultural value is that happiness comes from things and stuff, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. Okay. Our brains evolved, understandably, to crave in the interest of our early survival as a species during a time of scarcity when evolution selected for this trait. I mean, otherwise we couldn't have found food, we couldn't have protected ourselves and so forth. So our brains have a default, which is a sort of craving, appetite-based default. But we've moved beyond that. We moved beyond basic survival, and now we live in a world of plenty. So how do we manage skillfully all of those appetites, all of those cravings in a world of plenty? This is where the practice becomes so important. We have shifted our tendency to crave, which is dopamine mediated, as some of you know, from basic survival needs of our ancient ancestors, such as food, to a vast number of material objects. a vast number of things we can purchase, consume, go after, and so forth. And satisfying a craving is powerfully reinforcing through pleasure, the sort of the dopamine anticipation of it, and temporary happiness. And that just sets up this vicious cycle for more craving. And of course, in extreme instances, that leads to addictive behavior. I mean, that is the definition of addiction, which is why these tools are so important and so critical in getting us off this endless treadmill of craving, grasping, seeking, and all of that. So we set an intention in our practice to seek true happiness, by which I really mean contentment, and become less vulnerable to conditional happiness. So that is the challenge of conditional happiness.